Hiya guys, I'm Mr. Popov. I teach science. I hope you're all doing okay. I'm sitting here in my living room and I have the pleasure of reading chapter 11 to you. It's called Dozmary Mine. So please follow along with me. Alex walked through Port Talon, past the Fisherman's Arm Tavern and up the cobbled streets towards the library. It was the middle of the afternoon, but the village seemed to be asleep, the boats bobbing in the harbour, the streets and pavements empty. A few seagulls wheeled lazily over the rooftops, uttering the usual mournful cries. The air smelt of salt and dead fish. The library was red brick, Victorian, sitting so importantly at the top of an hill. Alex pushed open the heavy swing door and went into a room with a tiled chessboard floor and about 50 shelves fanning out from a central reception area. 6 or 7 people were sitting at tables working. A man in a thickly knitted jersey was reading Fisherman's Week. Alex went over to the reception. There was the inevitable sign, "Silence, please." Beneath it, an elderly, round-faced woman sat reading Crime and Punishment. "Can I help you?" Despite the signs, she had such a loud voice that everyone looked up when she spoke. Yes, Alex had come here looking because of a chance remark made by Herod Sale. He'd been talking about Ian Ryder. Spent half his time in this village, in the port, the post office, the library. Alex had already seen the post office, another old-fashioned building near the port. He didn't think he'd learn anything there. But the library. Maybe Ryder had come here looking for information. Maybe the librarian would help him. "Had a friend staying in the village," he said. "I was wondering if he came here. His name's Ian Ryder." "Ryder with an I or with a Y? Well, I don't think we've had any Ryders here at all." The woman tapped a few keys on a computer and then shook her head. "No." "He was staying at Sale Enterprises," Alex said. "He was about 40, thin, fair-haired. He drove a BMW. "Oh, yes," the librarian smiled. "He did come here a couple of times. A nice man, very polite. I knew he didn't come from around here. He was looking for a book." "Do you remember what book?" "Oh, of course I do. I always remember faces, but I never forget a book. He was interested in viruses." Viruses?" "Yes, that's what I said. He wanted information." "A computer virus. This might change everything." A computer virus was the perfect piece of sabotage, invisible and instantaneous. A single blip written into the software and every single piece of information in the Stormbreaker software could be destroyed at any time. But Herod Sale couldn't possibly want to destroy his own creation. That would make no sense at all. So maybe Alex had been wrong about him from the very start. Maybe Sale had no idea what was really going on. "I'm afraid I couldn't help him," the librarian continued. "This is only a small library, and our grant's been cut for the 3rd year running," she sighed. "Anyway, he said he'd get some books sent down from London. He told me in a box at the post office." That made sense too. Ian Ryder wouldn't want information sent to Sale Enterprises where it could be intercepted. "Was that the last time you saw him?" Alex asked. "Oh, no. He came back about a week later. He must have gotten what he wanted, because this time he wasn't looking for books about viruses. He was interested in local affairs." "What sort of local affairs?" "Cornish history. Shelf CL." She pointed. "He spent an afternoon looking in one of the books and then he left. He hasn't been back since then, which is a shame. I'd rather hope he'd join the library. Would you like to?" "Not today, thanks," Alex said. "Local history. That wasn't going to help him." Alex nodded at the librarian and made for the door. His hand was just reaching out for the handle when he remembered. CL 475/19. He reached into his pocket and took out the Game Boy, pulled off the back and unfolded the square of paper that he'd found in his bedroom. Sure enough, the letters were the same. CL. They weren't referring to a grid reference. CL was the label on a book. Alex went over to the shelf that the librarian had showed him. Books grow old faster when they're not being read, and the ones gathered here were long past retirement, leaning tiredly against one another for support. CL 475/19. The number was printed on the spine. It was called Dozmary, the story of Cornwall's oldest mine. He carried it over to a table, opened it, and quickly skimmed through it. Wondering why a history of local tin should have been of interest to Ian Ryder, the story it told was a familiar one. The mine had been owned by the Dozmary family for 11 generations. In the 19th century, there'd been 400 mines in Cornwall. By the 1990s, there were only 3. Dozmary was still one of them. The price of tin had collapsed and the mine itself was almost exhausted. But there was no other work in the area, and the family had continued to run it even though the mine was quickly exhausting them. In 1991, Sir Rupert Dozmary, the last owner, had quietly slipped away and blown his brains out. He'd been buried in the local churchyard in a coffin, it was said, made out of tin. His children were closed down the mine, selling the land above it to sale enterprises. The mine itself was sealed off with several of the tunnels now underwater. The book contained a number of old black and white photographs, pit ponies and canaries in cages, groups of figures standing with axes and lanterns. Now all of them would be under the ground themselves. Flicking through the pages, Alex came to a map showing the layout of the tunnels at the time when the mine was closed. It was hard to be sure of the scale, but there was a labyrinth of shafts, tunnels and railway lines running for miles underground. Going down to the utter blackness of the underground, you'd be lost instantly. Had Ian Ryder made his way into Dozmary? And if so, what had he found? Alex remembered the corridor at the foot of the metal staircase. The dark brown unfinished walls and the light bulbs hanging on their wires had reminded him of something, and suddenly he knew what it was. The corridor must be nothing more than one of the shafts from the old mine. Suppose Ian Ryder had gone down the staircase, like Alex, had been confronted with the locked metal door, and had been determined to find his way past it. But he had recognised the corridor for what it was, and that was why he'd come back to the library. He had found a book on the Dozmary mine. This book. The map had shown him a way to the other side of the door, and he'd made a note of it. Alex took out the diagram that Ian Ryder had drawn and laid it out on the page. On top of the map, holding the 2 sheets together, he held them up to the light. This was what he saw. The blue lines that Ryder had drawn onto the sheet fitted exactly over the shafts of the mine. It showed the way through. Alex was certain of it. If he could find the entrance to Dozmary, he could follow the map through to the other side of the metal door. 10 minutes later, he left the library with a photocopy of the page. He went down to the harbour and found one of those maritime stores that seemed to sell anything and everything. Here he bought himself a powerful flashlight, a jersey, a length of rope, and a box of chalk. Then he climbed back into the hills. Back on the quad, Alex raced across the cliff tops with the sun already sinking in the west. Ahead of him he could see the single chimney and crumbling tower that he hoped would mark the entrance to the Kenilworth shaft. It took its name from the ancient language of Cornwall. According to the map, this is where he should begin. At least the quad made his life easier. It would have taken him an hour to reach it on foot. He was running out of time and he knew it. The first storm break would have already begun leaving the planet, and in less than 24 hours the Prime Minister would be activating them. If the software really had been bugged with some sort of virus, what would happen? Some sort of humiliation for both Sale and the British government? Or worse? And how did a computer bug tie in with what had been seen the night before? Whatever the submarine had been delivering on the jetty, it hadn't been computer software. The silver boxes had been too large, and you don't shoot a man for dropping a diskette. Alex parked the quad next to the tower and went in through an arched doorway. At first he thought he must have made some sort of mistake. The building looked more like a ruined church than the entrance to a mine. Other people had been here before him. There were a few crumpled beer cans and old potato chip packets on the floor, and the usual graffiti on the wall. JRH was here. Nick loves Cass. Visitors leaving the worst parts of themselves behind in fluorescent paint. His foot came down on something that clanged, and he saw he was standing on a metal trapdoor. Grass and weeds were sprouting around the edges, but putting his hand against the crack, he could feel a draught of air rising from below. This must be the entrance to the shaft. The trapdoor was bolted down with a heavy padlock, several inches thick. Alex swore silently. He had left the zit cream back in his room. The cream would have eaten through the bolts in seconds, and he didn't have time to go all the way back to Sale Enterprises to get it. He knelt down and shook the padlock in frustration, and to his surprise, it sprang open. Someone had been here before him. Ian Ryder, it had to be. He must have managed to unlock it and hadn't fully closed it again, so that it would be open when he came back. Alex pulled the padlock out and grabbed the trapdoor. It took all his strength to lift it, and as he did so, a blast of cold air hit him in the face. The trapdoor clanged back, and he found himself looking into a black hole that stretched further than the daylight could reach. Alex shone his flashlight into the hole. The beam went 50 feet, but the shaft went further. He found a pebble and dropped it. At least 10 seconds passed before the pebble rattled against something far below. A rusty ladder ran down the side of the shaft. Alex checked that the cord was out of sight, then looped the rope over his shoulder and shoved the flashlight into his belt. He didn't enjoy climbing into the hole. The metal rungs were ice cold against his hands, and his shoulders had barely sunk beneath the level of the ground before the sun was blotted out, and he felt himself being sucked into a darkness so total he couldn't even be sure if he had eyes. But he couldn't climb and hold onto the flashlight at the same time. He had to feel his way. A hand, then a foot, descending further until at last his heel struck the ground and he knew he'd reached the bottom of Kenilworth's shaft. He looked up. He could just make out the entrance he'd climbed through, small, round, as distant as the moon. He was breathing heavily. The air was thin and smelled faintly metallic. Trying to fight off the sense of claustrophobia, he pulled out the flashlight and flicked it on. The beam leaped out of his hand, pointing the way ahead and throwing pure white light onto his immediate surroundings. Alex was at the start of a long tunnel. The uneven walls and ceilings held back by wooden beams. The floor was already damp, and a sheen of salt water hung in the air. It was cold in the mine. He had known it would be, and before he moved he pulled on the jersey he'd bought. Then he chalked a large X on the wall. That had been a good idea. Whatever happened down here, he wanted to be sure he could find his way back out. At last he was ready. He took 2 steps forward, away from the vertical shaft into the start of the tunnel, and immediately felt the weight of the solid rock, the soil and remaining streaks of tin bearing down on him. It was horrible here, like being buried alive, and it took all his strength to force himself on. After about 50 paces he came to a second tunnel, branching off to the left. He took out the photocopied map and examined it. According to Ian Ryder, this was where he had to turn off. He swung the flashlight round and followed the tunnel, which slanted downward, taking him deeper and deeper into the earth. There was absolutely no sound in the mine apart from his own rasping breath, the crunch of his footsteps, and the quickening thud of his heart. It was as if the blackness was wiping out sound as well as his vision. Alex opened his mouth and called out, just to hear something, but his voice sounded small and only reminded him of the huge weight above his head. The tunnel was in bad repair. Some of the beams had snapped and fallen in, and as he passed, a trickle of gravel hit his neck and shoulders, reminding him that the Dozmary mine had been locked for a reason. It was a hellish place. It could collapse at any time. The path took him ever deeper. He could feel the pressure pounding in his ears as the darkness grew thicker and more oppressive. He came to a tangle of iron and wire, some sort of machine buried long ago and forgotten. He stepped over it quickly, cutting his leg on a piece of jagged metal. He stood still for a few seconds, forcing himself to slow down. He knew he mustn't panic. He forced himself to think. If you panic, you'll get lost. Think what you're doing. Be careful. One step at a time. Okay. He whispered the words to himself to reassure him and then continued forward. Now he emerged in a sort of wide circular chamber formed by the meeting of 6 different tunnels, all coming together in a star shape. The widest of these slanted in from the left with the remains of a railway track. He swung the flashlight and saw a couple of wooden wagons that must have been used to carry equipment down or tin back up to the surface. Checking the map, he was tempted to follow the railway, which seemed to offer a shortcut across the route that Ian Ryder had drawn. But he decided against it. The map told him to turn the corner and go back on himself. There had to be a reason. Alex made another 2 chalk crosses, one for the tunnel he left and for the one he was entering, and he went on. This new tunnel quickly became lower and narrower until Alex couldn't walk unless he crouched. The floor was very wet here, with pools of water rising up to his ankles. He remembered how near he was to the sea, and that brought another unpleasant thought. What time was I tide? And when the water rose, what would happen inside the mine? Alex suddenly had a vision of himself trapped in blackness with water rising up to his chest, his neck, over his face. He stopped and forced himself to think of something else. Down here, on his own, far beneath the surface of the earth, he couldn't make an enemy of his imagination. The tunnel curved, then joined a second railway line. This one bent and broken, covered here and there in rubble. It must have fallen from above. But the metallic checks made it easier to move forward, picking up the reflection of the flashlight. Alex followed them all the way to a junction with the main railway. It had taken him 30 minutes, and he was almost back where he started. But shining the flashlight around him, he saw why Ian Ryder had sent him the long way round. The shorter route had been blocked by a tunnel. About 30 yards up the line, the main railway came to a dead end. He crossed the track, still following the map, and stopped. He looked at the paper, then again at the way ahead. It was impossible, and yet there was no mistake. He had come to a small round tunnel dipping steeply down. But after a brief stretch, the tunnel simply stopped with what looked like a sheet of metal barring the way. Alex picked up a stone and threw it. There was a splash. Now he understood. The tunnel was completely submerged in water, as black as ink. The water had risen up to the ceiling of the tunnel, so even assuming he could swim in temperatures that must be close to freezing, he'd be unable to breathe. After all this hard work and after all the time he'd spent underground, there was no way forward. Alex turned in frustration. He was about to leave, but even as he swung the flashlight around, the beam picked up something lying in a heap on the ground. He went over to it and leaned down. It was a diver's dry suit, and it looked brand new. Alex walked back to the water's edge and examined it with a flashlight. This time he saw something else. A rope had been tied to the rock. It slanted diagonally into the water and disappeared. Alex knew what it meant. Ian Ryder had swum through the submerged tunnel. He had worn a dry suit and he had managed to fix a rope to guide him through. Obviously he'd planned to come back. That was why he'd left the dry suit here and why he'd left the padlock open. Alex picked up the dry suit. It was too big for him, although it'd probably keep out the worst of the chill. But the cold wasn't the only problem. The tunnel might run for 10 yards. It might run for 100. How could he be sure that Ian hadn't used scuba equipment to swim through? If Alex went down there into the water and ran out of breath halfway, he could drown. Again his imagination got the better of him. He could see himself pinned beneath the rock in the freezing blackness. He couldn't imagine a worse way to die. He stood for a moment, holding the suit in his hands. Suddenly everything seemed unfair. He had never asked to be here. He had been forced into this by MI6, and he'd already done more than enough. There was nothing on earth that would make him enter the blackness of the water. It was simply too much to ask. But Ian Ryder would swum through. Ian Ryder had done it all. On his own. He'd never stopped. Not until the day they killed him. And Alex had always assumed that he was nothing more than a bank manager. He gave his resolve give way to anger. These people, Sale, Yassin, whoever had snuffed out his uncle's life simply because it had suited them. Well, he didn't die for nothing, Alex would see to that. He pulled on the dry suit. It was cold, clammy and uncomfortable. He zipped it up at the front. He hadn't taken off his street clothes, and that perhaps helped. The suit was loose in places, but he was sure it'd keep the water out. Moving quickly now, afraid that if he hesitated he'd change his mind, Alex approached the water's edge. He reached out and took the rope in one hand. It'd be faster swimming with both hands, but he didn't dare risk it. Getting lost in the underwater tunnel would be as bad as running out of air. The result would be exactly the same. He had to keep hold of the rope to allow it to guide him through. Alex took several deep breaths, hyperventilating and oxygenating his blood, knowing it would give him a few extra seconds. And then he plunged in. Cold was ferocious, a hammer blow that nearly forced the air out of his lungs. The water pounded at his head, swirling around his nose and eyes. His fingers were instantly numb. His whole system felt the shock, but the dry suit was holding, sealing in at least some of his body warmth. Clinging to the rope, he kicked forward. He committed himself now. There was no going back. Pull, kick, pull, kick. Alex had been underwater for less than a minute, but already his lungs were feeling the strain. The roof of the tunnel was scraping his shoulders, and he was afraid that it would tear through his dry suit and gouge into his skin as well. But he didn't dare slow down. Pull, kick, pull, kick. The freezing cold was sucking the strength out of him. How long had he been under? 90 seconds? 100? His eyes were tight shut, but if he opened them there'd be no difference. He was in a black, swirling, freezing version of hell, and his breath was running out. He pulled himself along the rope, scratching the skin off the palms of his hands. He'd been swimming for almost 2 minutes, but it felt closer to 10. He had to open his mouth and breathe, even if it was water and not air that rushed into his throat. A silent scream exploded inside of him. Pull! Kick! Pull! Kick! And then the rope tilted forwards and he felt his shoulders come clear and his mouth was wrenched open in a great gasp as he breathed air and knew he had made it. But made it to where? Alex couldn't see anything. He was floating in utter blackness, unable to see even where the water ended. He'd left his flashlight on the other side, and he knew even if he wanted to, he didn't have the strength to go back. He had followed the trail left by a dead man. It was only now that he realised it might lead only to a grave. Thank you guys. That's the end of chapter 11. Thank you for listening.